Welcome, listeners, to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm Jeanette Brown, your host, and I'm delighted to be with you. We know that application deadlines loom and that can quite understandably make applicants anxious. Today's podcast is designed to provide you with some top tips for approaching the written application so that you can go into it feeling confident, know that you've done the best job possible. We are pleased to welcome today Alex Brown, no relation. Alex is a longtime consultant and contributor to Clear Admit. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to hopefully providing some tips for those candidates getting ready to submit their applications.
And for those of you who are listening who know our Clear Admit Livewire and DecisionWire and ApplyWire tools, Alex is a regular contributor there, so you may have already interacted with him. He also helps with several of our webinars here on the site. But Alex, maybe you could tell a little bit about your expertise in the MBA admissions space, how you came to Clear Admit, and what makes you an authority on how to ace the written application.
Well, I'll try. I'm not sure what authority really means, but I've worked in the MBA admission space for more than 20 years. I started out in the early 1990s at the University of Delaware, but then moved up to the Wharton School, part of the University of Pennsylvania, and was a senior associate director of admissions there at Wharton for 7 years. And during that time, I actually taught in the professional development program for the Graduate Management Admissions Council, sort of teaching new admissions officers the ropes of the business. So I've done a lot of recruiting experience over the years, and hopefully that combined with my more than 10 years of work with Clear Admit helps me provide some insights into the written part of the application.
Terrific. I have no doubt. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Those deadlines are looming, and we don't have time to do separate episodes for each section of the written application. So I'm going to ask you to give me a couple of top tips for approaching the data form portion of the application itself.
Sure. Obviously, there are a variety of different elements to an application to a business school, to the MBA program, data forms, recommendations, essays, and so forth. And I think the data forms are actually probably the most underlooked aspect of the application. And concurrent to that, I also think the data forms have become more and more important in recent years as some schools have switched some of their essay inquiry into the data forms. So my first piece of advice for candidates applying in the next couple of weeks is stop everything you're doing and focus on these data forms. And I would suggest focusing on completing the data forms at least to the sort of draft form prior to tackling your essays. And the simple reason for that is I think the data forms actually provide really good context for what you should then be addressing in your essays and so forth. So yeah, my first piece of advice is actually data forms are really super important.
I think that's really helpful, and I hadn't thought through as much using the data forms as an exercise that helps you prepare for the essays, but I think that's a great point. Do you have another tip specifically related to data forms?
Sure. I mean, make sure, like I say, you recognize their importance. Some of the questions on the data forms can be pretty tricky. So you've got to provide some time and effort to complete them. Making sure that in terms of your professional experiences that are documented on the data forms, that your dates are accurate, your expression of your positions is accurate in terms of how your human resources would report your positions, because at the end of the day, if you're admitted, all this stuff will be checked by the sort of background check folks. So you don't want any unnecessary discrepancies in those regards. Some of the trickier questions that challenge candidates, I think, sometimes deal with their sort of, if they're asked about their parental information and the implications of that. And what I would suggest is rather than worry about the implications of whether your parents went to college, didn't go to college, have a great career, don't have a great career, etc. Is all this content sort of helps establish your story, your individual story. So the best way to answer these questions is simply providing the correct and honest answers. You'll also be asked by a number of schools, what are your connections to the school? So are your parents alumni of the school? Do you know alumni? And so on and so forth. So schools are pretty interested in your relationship with their alumni. And one of the reasons for that is that they're pretty smart at wanting to keep their alumni happy. So recognizing that also, sometimes you'll be asked what other schools you're applying, and that's a really difficult and perhaps unfair question to have to address in the application. But in terms of answering the question, I would suggest just be honest, list out the schools, list out the rationale for the schools, whilst also, to the extent that you can in the data forms, reaffirming why that particular school that you're applying makes sense to be a great fit for you. Those are some of the challenging questions. And sometimes now, like I said earlier, the goals question is sometimes asked directly in the data forms rather than as an essay question, as it traditionally was by pretty much every school. So at some point you're going to have to address your goals. Make sure those goals are well developed. Schools really do want to admit people that have a plan and a rationale for being there. So the point of it all is do the data forms first if you can. If you haven't tackled the data forms thus far, tackle them now.
All really good advice. And I, again, had not spent a ton of time thinking about how to answer questions about parents and alumni connections. And so there too, your insights are useful. What about the resume? Uploading a resume is standard protocol with MBA applications that I'm familiar with. How does this resume differ from other resumes? Is it just the resume that you used for the job prior to business school? What advice can you give specific to resumes?
Sure. I mean, I would start with your current resume, whatever that might be. But there are a few things that you need to do to it to prepare it for your business school application. One is, in most cases, it does need to be one page. So I would try very hard, even for all schools, to standardize it down to one page. Just be aware of that. And then I think most importantly, how it differs from your current resume is applying to business school means your resume and data forms and essays are actually going to be read by somebody, or some people, I should say, that are not directly necessarily familiar with your industry. So whereas if you're applying for another job within your firm or within your industry, that you can use jargon and everybody in your human resources in your industry understands exactly what you're talking about, you want to try to strip out your industry jargon to the extent that you can, and make sure that your achievements and accomplishments and successes at the different firms you've worked at are well understood by someone just not familiar with your industry. So I would just say that's probably the most important piece of advice, limiting it to one page, potentially putting your academics on top. Is often something that we talk about, although if it's one page, obviously your academics aren't going to be too far away. There is some debate on whether you should use a sort of an objective at the top of your resume, as you would perhaps when you're seeking a new position. The conventional wisdom is not to do so because you're all applying for an MBA and that should be obvious. My response to that, though, is perhaps maybe not in your actual application, but if you're bringing a resume to an interview, as an interviewer, it always delights me that I can read succinctly what your career goals are and why you're pursuing the MBA in a couple of sentences, and that would be the sort of summary objective of your resume. So to the extent that you do that in your resume and that ties and is consistent to anything that you put in your data forms about your career objectives as well as in your essays, I think that's just a very good thing. And that's one thing, obviously, to bear in mind. All these different parts of the application need to be sort of consistent. So what I read in your resume should make sense based off your data forms, off your essays, your recommendations, and so forth.
Terrific. And in terms of how you're describing the work experience that you bring, important to avoid jargon and to recognize that you'll be putting this in front of people who may be outside of your industry. What about, is it important to quantify work that you've done somewhere or show, like what's the best way to describe a position?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like any resume at this point, you want to quantify your results and your successes and make sure that they're, to the extent that they can be, they're measurable so that the person reading your resume can really understand the impact of your successes. So making things measurable using active verbs, various other sort of piece of advice that you'd find pretty much on a standard sort of resume. If you Google resume advice or something like that, you'd find pretty standard across CVs and resumes. But certainly you want to show your impact in your organizations, and you want to show them in as measurable a fashion as you can so that someone outside of your industry readily understands your successes.
Very helpful. And I will underscore, I moderated a few sessions of admissions directors earlier in the spring, and resumes came up there, and without exception, the admissions directors all stressed that they really wanted a single page resume to the extent that that was possible, given the amount of experience that most people are coming into an MBA program with. And say you have a gap in employment, how do you treat that on your resume?
I think, obviously you just be forthright and honest about your dates in your resume. So if the gap's 3 months or less, it's not going to be a big deal. If your gap is longer than 3 months, then the admissions committee is going to be curious as to what you did during that time, why there was a gap in the first place, and some of us are honestly laid off because the business climate suggests that has to happen in that particular industry. I mean, so some of these things are obviously outside of the individual candidate's control, but it's how you handle those situations and what you do with your time that says quite a lot about you. So the admissions committee will be interested in that, and whether that's handled directly in your resume or more likely actually in the optional essay that each school allows you to complete. You do need to address gaps that are longer than probably 3 months.
Terrific. And you jumped ahead a little bit. I am happy that you brought up the optional essay. Next, I'd like to ask you to share your tips specifically with regard to attacking the essays.
Sure. The essays, I believe, are probably the most important aspect of your candidacy. You have your test scores, they're obviously very important, your undergraduate record and so on and so forth. But those numbers basically determine if you're admissible. The reality is the majority of candidates, through some degree of self-selection, are going to be admissible for these top MBA programs. So the essays, along with the data forms, obviously, in your resume and so forth, really helps you differentiate yourself from other admissible candidates. And the essays, why I think they're probably the most important of these elements, is that they truly allow you to tell your story. And that's what the AdCom wants to know. They want to know your story. They want to know why you're planning to pursue this endeavor, this sort of 2-year experience. In the most part, sometimes obviously it's a 1-year MBA. And obviously taking quite a lot of risk in doing so, financial risk, and so on and so forth. So the essays allow you to tell your story, not only why you're doing it, and also what's interesting about you, your characteristics, your attributes, and so on and so forth. So I would suggest for the first part, to answer your question, the essays are fundamental to the success of your candidacy. So what are some of the things that you need to do? I would say prior to even addressing your essays, you need to come up with some kind of personal inventory. And this is something that I discuss in the admissions book that I authored along with Clear Admit a couple of years ago, that we still have available. Sort of take a step back and try to identify all your sort of admission stories that highlight your individual attributes, your leadership, your teamwork skills, your experience, variety of different experiences, the mistakes you've made that might be questioned in your application, and so on and so forth, your values, etc. So list out all the experiences that you have that highlight these attributes that are really important for admissions, and then start looking at the essay topics of the individual schools you're applying and try to figure out which are the best stories to tackle or to as you tackle these different essays, such that each of your applications provides a truly holistic view of who you are. I mean, that's just so super important. So my first piece of advice is take a step back before you address the essays and really think long and hard about your individual stories. In terms of actually writing your stories in the essays, there are probably a couple of things that I would suggest. One is that first paragraph needs to be super strong. You really want to engage your reader in that first paragraph, and you've got to really think that your readers, I should say, because your application will most likely hit at least 2 people before a decision is made. Your reader is going to be faced with maybe reading 10, 20 applications in a row. It's tiring work. I know I did it for 7 years. And, a lot of candidates sound pretty similar. So you really want to show how you stand out right in that first paragraph to engage me as a reader and get me excited to read more about you. So the first paragraph, I think, is really important. And then the second piece of advice I would give directly on writing is use this idea, show, don't tell. Don't tell me you're great. Show me why you're great, right? So provide examples and lead me down a path that makes me conclude that you are great, right? Rather than expressing that you are. And, many of us know people that love to tell everyone how good they are, but the real quality person is the person that does stuff and you realize how good they are. So using examples, show, don't tell, very important. Write very clearly. This isn't a lesson in expressing all your literary qualities. You've got to write clearly and understandably in a fashion that is easily digestible by someone that is reading very quickly, because that's what they are going to be doing. And finally, get feedback. Even the greatest writers in the world need editors to help them develop their prose. So as a candidate, get feedback, whether that's colleagues at work, people that know the MBA industry, people that don't, but getting feedback is really important.
Okay, I was struck by how many parallels to journalism and creative writing some of your tips had at the get-go. I know in my work it's important to have a strong first paragraph and grab the reader's attention, but it was helpful to have you paint the picture of what it's like as the person reading these applications and why it's important to wake them up and engage them. And then, of course, the show, don't tell, hugely important advice. And writing clearly, again, painting the picture of people needing to be able to understand quickly what you are telling them. And getting feedback. Did I miss one? Oh, I did want to ask you about when it makes sense to submit an optional essay.
Sure. So every school will ask if a supplemental essay, anything else that we should know about you. And I would suggest don't use that essay unless there are weaknesses in your candidacy that you need to address directly and provide context, not just excuses. And also to show why this weakness isn't something that will reoccur and affect your experience in the MBA program. So Perhaps your undergraduate GPA wasn't ideal, and you're going to explain why there's a blip in that undergraduate record, and perhaps you're also going to add the coursework that you've taken since your undergrad that sort of illustrate that this is no longer an issue, and that you've overcome it. And back to the sort of, if you've got a gap in your career, explaining that gap for 2 or 3 months, and so forth. So the optional essay is absolutely optional. It's not something that you should be using to tell another story. In fact, I would suggest if you use your optional essay to tell another story, that provides an element of risk in your application. It suggests that you don't think that the application essays that the school has provided are good enough for you, and it suggests that you think you're a little bit better than everyone else that's applying. And you've got to understand that the AdCom's got about 20 minutes to read an application and to come to some conclusion. And if your application is that much longer and it takes that much more time to cut through, you're telling the AdCom you're a little bit more important than everybody else, and that's probably not the right signal to take. So be very cautious when you're using the optional essay. But if you do think there's an area of your candidacy that requires additional explanation, provide that explanation, short and to the point.
Terrific. I will simply add a couple of points that I also hear admissions directors saying about essays in particular. One thing that is often repeated is advising applicants to make sure that they're answering the actual question that was asked. And it can certainly be tempting to repurpose essays from one school to the next. And you have to think about efficiencies and the strategy that you talked about earlier about your overall telling your story. So you may have some of the same essay content from school to school, but you want to make sure that you have taken the time to tailor it specifically to answer the question that the school is asking, because they're asking it for a reason.
And let me just reinforce that point, and it's a point that I neglected, so I'm glad that you brought it up. As an admissions officer, when I read essays, thousands of essays at the Wharton School, I was literally delighted when someone didn't answer a piece of the question, because it just gave me an easy out to say that, well, that person is going to get denied. And the reason why I was delighted is because most of the people applying are so wonderful that you think you're having to over-admit, etc., and your class is going to be too large. So if you just don't follow the rules, you're making it way too easy for the admissions reader to deny you. So just don't do that. You always have to think there are more qualified candidates than seats in the class. So it's up to you not to give the admissions committee people an excuse to deny you.
Such an important perspective. In terms of making sure that you have truly answered the question asked, again, I've heard admissions directors recommend reading your response, your essay, to a friend or family member, but not telling them what the question was and asking them to deduce what the question was based on what you've said. And if there's a disconnect, it's generally because you haven't answered the question. So just a tip that I've heard admissions directors provide.
I really like that tip, but I'd also suggest reading all your essays out loud, whether you're reading them to somebody or not, because read them out loud slowly, because that's the best way that you can make sure that you haven't included typos in your writing. What generally happens, and you know this, Jeanette, and I've done a bit of writing myself, is when we try to edit our own work and we're reading it silently, we're actually reading what we think we wrote rather than what we actually wrote. So if you're reading every word out loud, you're actually reading what you wrote. So make sure you do that, even if it's just a part of the editing process.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I also think, at least for myself in my own writing, when I read my work out loud, it helps me hear things that are maybe not as clear. So I wholeheartedly support that advice. What haven't we covered? And again, from the outset, we knew we were going to need to do this expediently, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. Are there tips that you don't want our listeners to leave this podcast without that we haven't covered?
The only other thing I have written down in my notes, and this isn't directly related necessarily to essays, data forms, and resume, but is sort of tangentially related to all three, is make sure before you address your candidacy through the written materials that your goals are well developed, your short-term goal and your long-term goal. And if they're not well developed, go interview some people, do some informational interviewing and get some clarity there before you address the written parts of your application. Because again, top schools generally have, a large population of their applicant pool is admissible. So they have the luxury of admitting those that really understand why they want to be at that school, how they're going to get involved, how they're going to be successful alumni. And if you read the mission statement of each of these schools, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for alumni that are going to go out and change the world in some regard. So you need to be able to convince AdCom that you're on a path to potentially doing that. And a part of that is going into the MBA program with a very well-developed sense of why you're doing it. I would suggest that even great candidates on paper can trip up if they've really not thought through why they're getting the MBA, what they plan to do shortly thereafter, and what their long-term ambitions are.
Excellent point. And you reminded me of one more thing too, which is that in my experience, and I think this is true not only in MBA admissions, but admissions and interviewing more broadly, schools want to know, they want to feel special. They want to feel like their school is special to you. And so it's valuable to put the time in to know the school and then be able to communicate how you are not just the best thing since sliced bread, but the combination of you and this school is the next PB&J.
I think you're absolutely correct. And there will be some schools that will place you on the wait list if they're not convinced that you've made a good case for why you plan to be at their particular school. There are two things you need to convince AdCom in a very broad sense through your written materials. The first thing is that you're good enough to be there, of which, like I said, 50 or 60% of candidates probably are, and obviously then the written materials can help you sort of push you into the top piece of that 50 or 60%. The second thing that you need to do is to convince AdCom that you want to be there. And for many schools that recognize that there are other more reputable schools out there, which there naturally are in the sort of the order of things, some of the schools will suspect that maybe you're also applying to another school, and you might get admitted by that school, and why would you want to come to their school? So you have to make a case to every school that you're applying that you want to be at that school, and come up with some real good rational reasons for your choice. So a lot of research up front. Jeanette brings up a vital point by doing this, and if you can visit the school, all the better. And some schools, if you don't visit, I'm sorry, that's going to be a real red flag for them.
Yeah, I know that NYU Stern actually states that they want you to visit. Obviously, there are sometimes circumstances where it's just not possible to visit every school, but to the extent that you can, it so brings literally to life the experience, and it just helps you have a much clearer sense of where you really feel comfortable, which will just benefit you hugely.
As well as showing the seriousness of your choice of that school.
Right, absolutely. Terrific. Well, we covered a lot of ground. It's been really a pleasure to talk through all of this. I'm going to see if I can't capture some of the main tips that you shared. In terms of data forms, stop everything you are doing and focus on them now. Don't leave them for the last minute. Recognize that they're a part of the strategy that you can use to approach your overall story. And sort of continuing with that, don't make careless errors. Make sure your dates are all in alignment and that you're describing your jobs the way that your HR director would. Resumes. Learn the ways in which a resume for business school needs to be a little bit different from some other resumes. Okay to start with the resume that you've used in the past, but recognize it's going to need modifications. It needs to be one page at most in almost every circumstance. If there's a gap in employment, just be honest about your dates and then be prepared to explain about a gap in employment elsewhere in the application. On essays, start by taking a step back, doing a personal inventory. And again, the data forms can kind of help as a first part of this process. Show, don't tell. Be a good storyteller. Bring things to life by providing concrete examples. Engage the reader from the get-go. Start with a strong first paragraph that will wake up an admissions director who maybe is reading your application as the last in a string of 20. Write clearly. Again, the application, the admissions directors and others reading the applications are reading a lot of them. So you want what you write to be easily digestible by someone who's reading quickly. Get feedback on your essays. Critically important. It can also be a way to identify places that aren't quite as clear. It can help you determine whether or not you answered the question asked. Choose wisely about submitting an optional essay. Do it when the case really calls for it, but don't think that you are special and you just get to submit an extra essay. And then the things that we just talked about, making the school feel like you really want to be there. There's so much more we can go into, but I think we need to cut it off there. Is there anything that's jumped to mind as I go through the list that you provided, Alex, that you want to share before we sign off?
No, I think honestly you summarised it all very well. The only other thing that obviously we haven't talked about is the recommendation forms. And, you know, at this stage, a couple of weeks, I suppose, ahead of deadlines, one would assume you've already selected who your recommenders are. And I would suggest, to the extent that you can, provide them some background, make sure they understand why you're pursuing the MBA, what your goals are, and perhaps some suggestions as some of the experiences and the anecdotes you'd like your recommenders to address. So prepare them. I would say, again, 2 weeks out from an application, I would remind them. So maybe go try to seek out a cup of coffee with them and see how they're doing. You're managing this process. So if they don't submit the recommendations on time, it actually sort of reflects on you as a candidate and your choice of recommender rather than on the recommender himself or herself, I suppose. So finally, in terms of the recommendations, answer their questions. I know some admissions officers might suggest, well, if you can't answer our questions directly, you can send more of a general sort of recommendation and that will be fine. And that might be fine, but you're sending a clear signal that that school is not your number one choice. And as we've mentioned before, that's not a good signal to suggest. So those are some of the quick things in terms of recommendations, but hopefully your recommenders sort of provide additional context, additional stories, and really sort of back up pretty much everything else that you've been able to address in your candidacy. And finally, I'd just say best of luck. If nothing else through this process, you should learn a lot about yourself. This is a massive process of self-reflection, and hopefully there is some personal value derived from that.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful, and I am glad that you gave sort of a Cliff Notes preview of recommenders. We're actually going to delve into that in greater detail in our next episode, so stay tuned if that's something that you're thinking about. And Alex, it was really such a pleasure. Thank you for making time and for sharing your insights and expertise. And For our listeners, if you have enjoyed what you've heard today in previous episodes, we would be so grateful if you would rate us in iTunes. Doing so helps us appear to other folks who are searching and might likewise benefit from the content. That's it. Thanks so much for tuning in to the ClearAdmit MBA Admissions Podcast. Alex Brown, thanks again for joining me, and come back.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Best of luck, everyone.